Series on religious experience. Tonight we're talking about one I suppose that is more familiar, that people usually link with the notion of religious experience. I feel in the past I've been at pains to try to say that the boundary experience is indeed an authentic experience and the prophetic experience and so on. I know what you have to do with that. Glenn, somebody else knows also. I don't know why that happened just at that moment. Oh, that was not this recorder. Glenn, it's all right. That was not this system, I'm told. Fortunately, we're taping all of this for national consumption. I think that's terrific. Anyway, tonight, talking about mystical experience, I think is the thing that people often link with what a religious experience is all about. In that way, perhaps we're on somewhat familiar turf. In another way, as I told somebody in preparing it, seems harder to me to make this talk relevant to our current situation, more difficult than any of the other topics that I have dealt with. But I think that perhaps one experience that we begin with is our own sense of estrangement in life. Any of the ways in which we feel alienated from ourselves or from others or from our God. Because a mystical experience has to do with overcoming alienation and estrangement and achieving some sort of integration. So any of us who are feeling at loose ends at all, or scattered, or not centered, probably can find something worthwhile in this whole presentation. And I think that many people, a growing number of people today, are talking about the spiritual life, about how they can pray better, how they can meditate better, and Teresa of Avila is the great classic guide for that kind of process. And I think for some people in here, I know that they end up talking to others about important matters, doing spiritual direction either formally or in sort of informal situations with other people. And so I think perhaps what I have to say would be helpful with all of that as well. And I think for any of us who are interested in growth at all, it is helpful to see how somebody else has gone before us and set the stage or made progress in life, and it might give us a little motivation and help us one way or another to make progress in our own spiritual life. That much, I'm hoping can connect us in something out of our own experience. The loose ends business, scattered feeling, wanting to be more contented, at peace, integrated, and so on. All of that would be part of what we're trying to heal by looking at Teresa of Avila. Now, when I'm talking about Teresa of Avila, I'm talking about a 16th century figure in Spain. Some of you perhaps have a feel from this remembering the El Greco exhibit, because at that time in our city there was a lot of talk about Spain during that period. Spain was the most powerful country in the world. It was in what we call the Counter-Reformation period. It's to locate. You remember Luther nails his theses up on the door in 1517, sort of inaugurating the Protestant Reformation. Council of Trent was the great response to that in the Catholic community, and occurring in the 16th century. And so that's where Teresa was living, and she was also living in a time of the Inquisition. The Inquisition was established really in 1478, and they were interested in doctrinal purity and keeping things in check. As a matter of fact, the Inquisition kept going all the way up till 1834. And it was a rough thing. I mean, people got in trouble. If you remember some of those stories, the Archbishop of Toledo, Spain, was actually in prison for 4 years by the Inquisition. So, I mean, they didn't spare anybody. Do you remember that story about John of the Cross in Toledo, Spain, where he, just a little time after Teresa, his own order didn't like some of the things he was doing, and they made him captive, kept him in prison, and they used to beat him regularly every night as part of their sort of evening ritual. So, I mean, we're talking here about a seriousness about religion. I mean, these people were fanatical in a way about doctrinal purity. We're going to see that one of the reasons Teresa wrote this book that we're going to be talking about tonight is because her other book was in the hands of the Inquisition at the time, and she didn't really know what was going to happen. So we're in a difficult period here in Spain, and yet a time when there was this tremendous flowering of the whole mystical experience. I will run over her life briefly. She was born in Avila in 1515. Her father was a very religious man. Her mother died when she was 12. That seemed to be an important factor. At the age of 14, her father shipped her off to sort of a boarding school. She came under the influence of the Augustinian nuns there. Was very impressed and decided she wanted to enter religious life. Her father really liked her around the house, didn't want her to do that, tried to persuade her not to, and then at the age of 20 she had to flee her home, get away from her father, and enter the Carmelite convent. Displeased her father, hurt him greatly, but he overcame that, recovered, and sort of went along with it. At the age of 23 then she got very sick. In fact, she almost died. It was during that time that she began to have certain mystical experiences, and I think they said up to 3 years later she still wasn't able to walk. So this was really serious illness in her middle 20s. And when she began these mystical experiences. But during this time, and all the way up to her age 39, even though she had had these strong experiences, she really was in this terrible turmoil about life in the world, worldly thoughts and so on, and the spiritual life, which was important to her. And she sort of couldn't get all of that together. And it was only then at the age of 39 that she had two really powerful experiences that began her on this road to greater perfection. And one, she encountered a statue of our Lord, and she sort of felt at that time that she should give her complete trust over to Jesus, and that began to make a difference in her life. Shortly after that, she was reading Augustine's Confessions. Always nice to know when one says that one knows something about that. And I remember the voice calling to Augustine. Well, Teresa telling him take up and read, beginning a major part of his conversion. Well, she at that time heard this voice, inner voice, saying to her that indeed she should follow the Lord with her whole heart. She felt the Lord himself was calling her in her heart. And so at the age of 39 then, she really did begin to get even more serious about this growth in the spiritual life. At the age of 41 then, she had her first rapture. I'm going to talk about that. That is sort of an out-of-the-body experience where her soul sort of left for a while. Age of 47, she started writing things. She never liked to write. Her confessors periodically would tell her to write, mostly because they thought that maybe all this was illusion on her part. And they weren't sure all this stuff was really happening, and so they would want her to write it down so they could sort of check it out. And they felt some of them were more positive about it and wanted her to write for the benefit of other people. So she did. She wrote the book of her life at the age of 47. And then in 1562, then, she began, which is a sort of pattern with some of these mystics, she began a more active life because she was moved by some of her mystical experiences to think she should found another convent. She had been living in a convent of 180 people, and I think she thought it was too lax in some ways or not dedicated enough to the spiritual life. So she went out and founded another one of 11 sisters who would live together and just would be totally devoted to developing the spiritual life in themselves. And she went along with this. The founder, or the general of the order, wanted her to do more of these, so she went around and founded about 14 of these smaller convents like this. She got John of the Cross to help her with that whole process. She ran into a lot of difficulties. She's a very active woman. She started having all this correspondence. She talks about being up till 2 in the morning answering letters, and then having to get up again at 5 o'clock and go and practicing the office with the rest of the sisters. She came to know them important people. It's thought that she had an audience with Philip II, who liked her work and collected it after her death and so on. And then she wrote various things as she went along. 1572, at the age of 57, she had the real culmination of all of these experiences, which she called the spiritual marriage, and we will talk more about that. Then at the age of 62, she was told by her confessor to write sort of this synthesis of her life, the one that I'm going to use, synthesis of her thinking, I should say, and that is The Interior Castle. That's what we will be talking about and analyzing. So that's a work produced in her middle 60s. And then at the age of 67, they wanted her to travel to Alba, and she was very tired, didn't want to, and it just wore her out terrifically, and she died there as a result of a lot of that weakness and fatigue. Then in 1622, she was canonized a saint. Well, Teresa of Avila is an interesting figure. She combined the mystical life, the active life. She had a great sense of humor. She was a very personable kind of person, outgoing and warm and strong. Powerful woman, made a difference in her world at the time. Her writing is very personal. She didn't go back and check anything. She didn't punctuate or put paragraphs. She was sort of, not a polished writer in that way, but she just wrote out of her guts. She sort of wrote out of her spirit as it came to her. And she wouldn't even go back and reread what she had written, so it's a very colloquial style, so on. She had one of her great crosses in life was that her friends didn't understand her. Her confessors thought that she was deluded, and a lot of times that was very difficult for her to take. Might give just a little feeling for her life and the kind of person that we're dealing with here. Now, I want to turn to her synthetic work, or masterwork, many authors would feel, The Interior Castle. Now, the inspiration for this seemed to come to her all at once, and she talks about this inspiration that you could think of growth in the spiritual life like a castle made out of diamonds, in which there were many rooms in the castle. But all those rooms sort of led into an inner chamber, into a center room where God himself was dwelling. And that the process of the spiritual life really was to try to get from the exterior world in there into the center where the Lord was present. As I say, she wrote it very intuitively, not rationally or cerebrally at all. I think that her whole schema is interesting. What it provides us with is sort of a 7-step series of how one would deepen the spiritual life. As we're very into this kind of thing these days, we're always talking about stages of growth and development, and we got Kohlberg and Piaget and Fowler and all those people talking about how we would grow. Well, I think the metaphor that Teresa of Avila has adopted is quite interesting, because you don't have the feeling like you're climbing a ladder so much and getting to higher stages, although that's our language and I'm very comfortable with it. But it's more like you're moving inward gradually into a center point where one will indeed meet the Lord. Okay, now what I want to do is to talk about each one of these experiences that she talks about, describe it, tell you some of the advice she gives us, and then use it as a springboard to make a comment about something that seems more significant or relevant perhaps to us today. So as always, the way I view these authors is as a dialogue. So in reading Teresa of Avila, I'm in dialogue with her. I'm trying to say, well, what she would tell us about our life today, and then in a sense you're in dialogue with me. So as I talk about her, then what we hope happens is that there's sort of an inner dialogue going on inside of you. It's a catalyst for your own thinking, and so on. So, the first dwelling place now in the first stage, if we're going to use that kind of terminology, I better preface this by saying if some of you know Teresa's works and this doesn't sound familiar to you, it is because I am translating a lot. In other words, where Teresa of Avila is talking about the soul, I will usually talk about the person, so on. So I'm translated, I think, some of her language into more existential categories, and I think that I'm saying the same thing that she really was telling us. So she starts out with the idea a lot of people aren't into the castle at all. They're living in the external world. They're interested in only what's happening around them. They're interested in business and all the other things out there. They have no spiritual life at all, no inner life. And what happens then is that some people begin to enter into their own spirit. They do it, the doorway into the first room of the castle, first dwelling place, is prayer. That's what begins to start the process of moving inward. So the people in the first room now are people who in a month's time pray now and then. When they pray, they are usually very distracted. They do it in a very hurried way. Their mind really is mostly back out there, outside the first door of the castle, out where all of the family life is going on, the business life, and everything else. A lot of distraction. When they start to pray, they have a great trouble calming themselves. Mostly their mind is flitting all over the place, and it really takes just sort of a great willpower to get in that first door. In other words, they don't feel like praying, and they got to just sort of crank it up in order to get in that first door and find just a couple times during a month's period when they can begin to try to talk to the Lord in one way or another. Now, what sort of advice does Teresa give about all of this? Well, she says that it is really good to hear about the spiritual life. It would be good if these people encountered somebody else in their life who liked to talk about deeper matters, because that would be a catalyst for them to start to think more deeply about their own life. And they shouldn't feel bad when they're talking to other people the first time who are more deeply into it. They shouldn't feel bad about this, but be very patient with themselves, which is a sort of constant bit of advice as she goes along. And then people in that first room should start to think pretty seriously about avoiding mortal sins, because mortal sins will start to be seen as something that throws a darkness over oneself. Well, it keeps us from seeing life as it really is. The contradictions of life won't appear to us in the society, the culture in which we live, if there's too much of this serious sinning going on, because it will darken the intellect and keep us from allowing that reflected light in this first room to really come through to us at all. And then she tells us that if you start into the first room, you better be ready for a long and tough journey. Because if you start getting serious about it, it's going to be a painful business, and it's going to be a hard, laborious process to move through these various rooms into the center. She tells us that our potential in life is so much greater than we might ever imagine. So somebody in that first room is sort of thinking, well, that's about as much as I could manage. 15 minutes of prayer once a week, that's about it, man. Enough. But she says that people will be surprised. They will be amazed at the potential that's within their own heart, and that if they simply give it a chance, they will be able to begin to tap that. Why? Because God will be found in the center. And then she talks a lot about the fears of life. A lot of fears involved in even starting on this path. One is sort of afraid that one will fail. And so one will say, well, I have no sense in starting, no sense setting up a program of trying to pray every day, because I probably won't keep it, and then I'll feel bad about myself and be overtaken by guilt feelings. And she says instead of focusing on all those fears, you might focus on Christ and on the other good people around. Because if you see the other good people who are able to sustain a little richer and deeper life, that will give you courage to be able to carry on yourself. And then she says, beware of getting too much into this in terms of penitential practices and so on. She's big on not hurting your health. No, don't get carried away so like you start fasting too much when you really need the food. Because that will just, in the long run, it isn't going to work. As you're going to see, Teresa's got a great sense of the long haul, of the big picture, and you don't want to sort of blow it all right away. And you want to go gradually about this whole thing. At the same time, she says to beware of perfectionism. Beware of trying to say, boy, I'm going to shape up all at once, or I'm going to be just great or terrific. She reminds us that growth is really a gradual sort of process. And then she says finally in the listing that I have here that don't harp on the little faults of others. That will just throw you off the track. So now you're starting to do a little praying, and maybe now other people get on your nerves and so on. She says don't be harping on that. Sort of let go of a lot of that. And finally, it brings me to the point that I want to springboard here in the first thing. She is extremely big on self-knowledge. Self-knowledge and prayer are vital to entering this first room, and as a matter of fact, through the whole process. And I want to comment at greater length on that now, because I think she's on to something that is crucial. It's sort of a change of model in the way we think about prayer. Oftentimes prayer is thought of, well, there's this supreme being who I want to talk to, and I got to get his attention and tell him what I need or thank him for what's going on, and I got to say it often or loud or something to make sure I get through. And the notion of prayer that I think would result from this emphasis on self-knowledge is very different. Prayer becomes now a matter of cultivating one's own self-awareness, of increasing one's self-knowledge. I remind you of Merton's metaphor for prayer. He said it is a movement from the false self to the true self, in which we peel away the masks and the facades that we use to interact with other people, with our world, and often necessary to have those. Can't expose ourselves entirely to everybody we meet. Have to have some of those facades, but that the process of prayer is one in which we are stripping away those masks so that we come to know who we are despite the mask, so we know what really lies behind it, and in coming closer to our true self that we will move towards the center point of this castle and eventually encounter our God, or in each of the rooms encounter the God whose light is reflected in each of these 7 rooms. Now she reminds us of something else, I think, that it seems important about this whole prayer business, is that the distractions are going to come in. She'll talk about this later on, but one of the things that we have to figure out to do with all of this is how to deal with these distractions. What the prayer is supposed to help us to do is to get a lot of those things that we have going on in our life in some sort of perspective. And one of the things that I suggest to people is that they simply pray about what is going on in their life. In other words, one could pray, talk to God about the fact how hard it is to concentrate. Or I remember telling one person one time who was very angry at God and therefore thought that she could never pray to God, to suggest to her that she talk to God precisely about her anger, and that would overcome this impasse. So that becomes the grist of the prayer, the substance. So what we're trying to do here is to use this prayer, therefore, as getting in touch with who we are. We have to know ourselves. We have to know how the world distracts us. We have to try to know what lurks in the very center of our being, what the dark forces are, what the strengths and weaknesses are, and all feeling that that self-knowledge is a way of coming closer to our God. And as we'll see, she constantly insists that at each stage of movement into the depths of ourself, that kind of prayer and self-knowledge is vital. So, you follow me? There's really a shift of model of what prayer is all about. So prayer itself becomes a matter of self-awareness. I was talking to a woman just, was it this morning or yesterday morning, who claimed she didn't believe in Christianity, and she told one of her statements that she has no use for prayer. And so I told her just what I'm saying here, of what I thought prayer was. I gave her Merton's metaphor and definition, and her response was, oh, if that's what prayer is, yeah, I'm into that. That makes sense to me. She says, in fact, I do that all the time. And so what it seems is that this prayer that we're talking about is something that could just flow and could be going on as we're driving someplace or walking someplace or ending a conversation with somebody, because this increase of self-knowledge means an increase in our knowledge of God, of self-awareness and awareness of God closely tied together. Okay, now I will move to the second room here. Again, moving inward. The good thing to remember here is that she doesn't think that there's just 7 rooms in the castle, because that first room she's describing got a lot of other rooms around it. She's not silly enough to think that there's just 7-step sequence here. She sees a lot of variations, but this is her way of explaining the outline in general. Okay, I suppose some of us could stick with her here. We're going to all drop off, as we go along here. I hope everyone realizes that. When it comes your time, rather than get up and leave, Teresa suggests that it is helpful to hear about the next stage, because we just might want to try to go there. So now we move to this next stage. Now, these people are becoming a little more serious about the spiritual life. They're trying to avoid excessive preoccupation with all the things that are going on in their world. Now, they're more attuned to the call of the Lord, but it comes mostly through other people, through experiences of life, through the trials, through reading books, and sometimes in the experience of prayer itself. But what happens as we become more attentive to all of this is that now more inner conflicts occur. I think she's hearkening back to some of her own early experiences, because now one is feeling more the bite of saying, hey, I ought to be praying more, and here I am so busy, all these pulls on my time, and I'm not getting around to it. So now, instead of being sweetness and light, we got a little dissonance inside of ourselves, saying, I ought to be working harder at this. But these people, as a matter of fact, now do pray more often in this particular stage. I feel pulled, however, between this light that's sort of attractive now. It's beginning to be sort of nice at times to pray, but one's very busy and got a lot of other things to do, so we can't get into it too heavily. Okay, kind of advice that she offers to us. She says, try to get in perspective these cares about the world, about how we are esteemed by other people. Try not to get overly upset about what other people think about us, or whether they like the meal that was served, or how we dress, or things like that. And she says, try to be careful about excessive care about health. It's interesting, this comes up a lot throughout her writings about health, and how one can get hung up on that. So try to get that into some sort of perspective, she thinks. She says it sometimes helps to recall how the successful and proud people in the world have died. To meditate on death is sort of like, well, what did it mean that they had all of these things, or had it made? Death comes, the grim reaper comes no matter what. What are you going to do about it? She says that we should expect this conflict. Don't get upset about it. Be patient with yourself. You can't overcome these temptations right away. Go at it sort of gradually. And she says, be prepared to fight, because as you get more serious about the spiritual life, the demonic element is going to get stronger. It's going to, the darker side of ourself, the shadow side, is going to need to rebel somehow against this greater spirituality that is going on. Dryness is going to be part of the process. Don't expect that all of this will be sweetness and light. Find other people that you can talk to about this. It's good to have a group, a study group, where one can read the Scriptures and talk about it. To have a friend, a confidant that one can describe one's struggles to. And she suggests that it's good to get a spiritual guide, someone who could sort of help one in this whole process. She says, don't get compulsive about trying to make progress. Don't think, boy, I got to overcome these temptations, or boy, I got to get into this 7th castle room here sooner. Go deal with oneself gently. I often find myself advising people that, give yourself a gentle push. My father had another strategy. He gave hard pushes. But it seemed that he says for yourself, maybe that's good to have somebody else maybe, but with yourself, be gentle. Gentle push forward in life. And she says, deal directly with the fear of failure. Try to face up to the fact, I didn't pray today. Don't give a lot of excuses for that, but try to say, that's right. I said I was going to do it, and I really didn't end up doing it at all. Now, let me use the springboard again to make some other comments, and that is this. What I get out of all that is that self-acceptance is at the center of the spiritual life. Karl Rahner has said, you remember him, Uncle Carl, our friend. Rahner said that the whole of the spiritual life is involved in self-acceptance. That's what it's all about. It's simply that. But oh, how hard it is to accomplish that. Self-acceptance. Now that seems to have two sides. One is accepting the goodness in ourselves, the talents and the gifts, being in touch with those, knowing what they are. And a lot of times that takes a long time in life to figure out. Some people, I was talking to a woman recently who went back to school at sort of an advanced age, and she had all kind of doubts whether she really could do that. And she found out she was terrific. She said, I'm better than all the rest of those students. Oh, this seems to be the discovery of talent seems to take a while in life. And so part of this is to know who we are from the perspective of the positive side. And who are we when we finally get around to it? We are people who have a light shining at the very center of our being, a potential that has not yet been tapped. People say we tap about 10% of our powers as we go along in life. So the truth of the matter is that there is so much there just waiting to be used. And the second part of self-acceptance, of course, is to accept the shadow side of ourselves, the dark side. The fact that we are not totally integrated. There's things about ourselves we don't like. Don't like the way we deal with our anger. Don't feel good about how we are dealing with our sexual drives. Don't feel worthy of the kind of love that we receive from other people. There's things inside of us here that war against us. And part of the realism of self-acceptance is to get in tune with that, to be open enough to allow it to surface, to bring the shadow side into the light of consciousness. Let the light shining from the center of the castle shine on those dark spots in order that they can be transformed. Not that they are done away with. Again, I was talking to someone recently about the whole area of sexuality and trying to make clear what one would be trying to do with all of that rather than just repress it. And the idea is that one has to take that fantasy life that was disturbing this person so much and say, he said in his own words, make it his own. Say that fantasy life, that's me. That's right. Some of them are weird and wild and crazy. But that's me. And that seems to be the first step in trying to move towards this acceptance of the negative sides of life. Part of this acceptance of the negative is to know that we're going to be distracted in prayer. It's to know that we set up a program and we're probably going to fail in some ways as we try to carry it out. So, second dwelling place, self-acceptance. Trying to go with what we really are. Do you see the wisdom of Karl Rahner? Self-acceptance is everything. Because the acceptance of self is the acceptance of God. Because who are we? We are creatures oriented to God. Who is at the center of our being? The one we call the absolute mystery, that we address as Abba, Father. That's who we are. So that if we ever got in touch with who we are, we find not there just shadow or darkness or emptiness, although it may appear that way, we eventually find the one who has created us, the source of all we are, and the goal of all of our longings. Self-acceptance is the acceptance of God. Just pure and simple, is. Put together. And a way of thinking of what the spiritual life is really all about. Now we'll move into the moving inward now. Sort of a neat image, isn't it? Instead of moving upward, moving inward into the next room. We open the door as always is prayer, and now what is going to happen? Now, we're really serious about improving in the virtues. We're trying not to sin at all, not just to avoid serious mortal sins, but now we're trying to avoid even small sins. We're trying to not hurt other people in tiny kinds of ways. Now, we sort of are fond of doing penance. It seems good to do some penance now and then. We don't have to just exactly force ourselves, but it sort of fits in. So I'm going to abstain from meat on Friday now because our bishops have asked us to do that. And we're abstaining because we want to be symbols of peace in our world, reintroducing an old custom, but that doesn't seem burdensome. That just seems sort of right to do. No big deal. Doing a little penance for peace is a really fine thing to try to accomplish in one's life. And, in addition, we're sort of fond of having those periods of recollection. One likes to meditate now. You don't have to just force the meditation. Now you like it, and if you miss it, if you don't get it in a day, you miss it. Feel, geez, that's too bad. I always feel better when I meditate each morning. I function better. Now we're really sort of fond of it, as she says. And the other thing that happens is that the character gets balanced out more. We appear to other people as being more balanced and integrated, both in the way we speak, not excessively boastful and not excessively timid. Our lifestyles appear to have balance in them between recreation and work and our family obligations and so on. It's sort of coming together here in a way. And there is a greater feeling of security now, feeling more together as I go along. Okay, some description here maybe of this third stage, third castle. It's sort of upbeat kind of stage in the whole process here. And again, I know many good people who are probably find themselves here, are comfortable with that kind of description. Okay, now some of her advice, standard advice you'll see peppered throughout each of the stages. Again, be patient with yourself. Don't get compulsive about wanting to move to room 4. Stay there for a while. It's okay. And she talks about dealing with dryness, because sometimes when you're in the third room, as you're going along doing your meditation, even though you feel it's good to get in, it's dry. You don't get anything out of it. There's no consolations, as she says. And she suggests that we deal with that through humility. Something like this, like, hey, I don't really deserve that anyway. I'm not all that great that I got to be feeling terrific after my meditation. So she thinks that humility really is very helpful part of this whole thing. And she talks about realizing that there might be a sort of inner peace that's growing in you, even though part of you doesn't feel it. She's a very clever psychologist, Teresa of Avila. She has a tremendous understanding of the psyche. And she's saying that, hey, you might be going along here and you're not getting a lot of seeming consolations, and if someone asked you, you wouldn't say, wow, that was a tremendous prayer experience or something. But you might be missing something. There might be sort of an inner peace, part of this secure feeling that's growing inside of you like a strong core, or the light is sort of getting at you more that's radiating out from the center of one's being. So be on alert for really all of that. She says a lot of minor irritations may arise in this particular stage. And she says, people might bug us, or the phone rings when you're trying to meditate. That's not her advice, that's part of the translation. Phone rings during this meditation, and so on. And she says, we really ought to prepare ourselves ahead of time for this. Don't get, we're living busy lives and all that. Don't get in the frame of mind like, hey, this will flow. Expect the phone to ring. That you expect you're going to get interrupted, and then that'll be okay, and use it as a springboard for personal growth in life. She says this will help you with your self-knowledge, help you to understand yourself. Well, why is it that phone call bugged me so much on this occasion? I'll probably find out maybe it's the person who called me who I'm not too thrilled with. And maybe that person represents a type of person that I don't really handle well. And therefore I begin to find out why it bugs me so much. And then I begin to learn something about myself and how I might make progress in life. She says, make sure you're grateful for getting this far to the third room. Make sure you say your prayers of thanks for all of that. She makes a nice observation. She says, remember, perfection does not involve greater delights, consolations, and all that. She says, but perfection involves greater charity. So all the time she doesn't want us to get hung up on feeling good about our prayer life. Like it gives me this great joy or enthusiasm, liberation, and so on. Concentrate on charity. She says reading books about the next stage could be helpful. I think we've seen that kind of advice before. Interesting one here for people in the stage. Be careful not to think that everyone else has to be as balanced as we are. It's part of that business of when one gets to this stage and sort of feels like one's life is sort of ordered and got a nice balance going here and so on, don't think every other person's got to follow that same path. Deal more easily with people who are out of balance. The people who go to extremes and so on. Don't think you got to force your mold upon all of them. They have their own path to follow. Okay, now let us look at the springboard from this kind of thing. And I want to comment here on this idea that people are more into this prayer and meditation, and to talk a bit about meditation as one of the great means we have of moving forward and the kind of thing in this room that we ought to be doing regularly. We have to remember that for a while meditation was out, even in where we think it ought to have been in religious communities a lot of times, among the priests and so on. We sort of lost the meditative tradition. We forgot a whole lot of wisdom that we had. Even going through the seminary in my time, I don't really recall any great insights given to this whole business of how one could go about meditating and learning how to do that better. And what has happened in our own culture is a lot of this has come back not through the monasteries and convents, but through Eastern religions. How often did I run into young people who got turned on by TM, Transcendental Meditation, or went to a class in Zen Buddhism and so on, and thereby found out that, wow, this meditation is neat. So it really has, in the culture as a whole, the Eastern world has resurrected, I think, this idea of what meditation, the great value of it. What really is it? How can we try to describe it? Well, meditation, I think, is an attempt to systematically and carefully move into the center of our being, take time to focus our energies and attention so that we can move into a state that is often called contemplation, where without any great effort or anything, we simply are able to be in God's presence. So the way I'm going to use the term, I mean it mostly as a means, a tool in a way, that moves us towards this greater contemplation. But not only is it a means, it's also, as some authors say, a way. Because as we're doing it, we are in that process somehow attuning ourselves to God, being more in God's presence. So I'm saying it really in two ways. In one way, it's a means to get someplace else, but at the same time, the meditation we do has intrinsic value. It is a way in itself. It is precisely to be closer to God as we're going along with all of this. Now, what are the effects of the meditation? What's it supposed to be doing for us? Well, this has been studied now scientifically. Some of you know the book, The Relaxation Response by Benson, Harvard MD. And they wire people up and find out what it does to them. And it does all kinds of neat things, like lower one's blood pressure and slow down one's heart rate. It tries to help people to feel more integrated in one way or another. A lot of times people report they have more energy if they meditate regularly, and they do it in the middle of the afternoon. They find they are sort of refreshed throughout the rest of the day, and so on. So all of this is documented. I mean, medically, it does do these things to one. It takes some of the lactic acid out of the bloodstream. As I say, some people use it as a means of controlling blood pressure. But it also has spiritual effects, and that is sort of a sense of quiet or calmness, a feeling of integration. We feel as though instead of being so scattered that we're brought together. My own feeling in meditating is that I feel lowered. My center of gravity that might be up here in these tense muscles begins to move downward somehow and inward. And so that one doesn't feel so scattered and living sort of up here. You feel as though you're living out of some deeper source in the center of one's being. Okay, what is happening in all this? Why might this be working? Well, you find a lot of other different suggestions about this. One is that meditation releases the right brain activity by slowing down the left brain activity. So it's been thought that the left brain is the rational, empirical, logical side where we're always figuring things out and so on. We spend most of our life doing that. In the Western world, we're just predominantly that way. That's all we're ever doing, in a sense. And that what happens when you meditate and concentrate on one small thing, then the left brain activity gets shut down and the right brain activity can increase. I know that my own self, the way I like to do it is to sort of feed ideas into myself and then meditate, and I find very often that my most creative moments come then. Then I begin to make connections between things. Things will come together. Sometimes I like to sit with a pad of paper next to me, and when I'm meditating then and the ideas will flow, I just jot them down real quickly so I can let go of them, so I don't have to be trying to remember it or anything, and just allow that process to continue. Another way of thinking about what happens in meditation is that we concentrate ourselves on the whole rather than on discrete objects in our world. So instead of thinking about this person or this task, now my mind, my spirit, my heart gets focused on the whole. So very often people will say they have a more global sense of life, more integrated sense of things if they are meditating regularly. Then some practical advice maybe about how to go about this, and then I will finally conclude by some of the techniques. Perhaps haven't proceeded exactly wrong in that, but we come to that last. I hope people, when I've said meditation, have just at least some preliminary sense of what I mean. But some of the practical steps in becoming a better meditator seems to be, one, getting a better perspective on our moral life as a whole, having our world somewhat together, having our heads straight on what our priorities are and what we're about and what path we're trying to travel in life. Then it seems good to find a good time to do it, time when one doesn't fall asleep, where one can stay awake, time when it's practical, when it can happen. I know I've been talking to a sort of guide to a priest and been talking about his prayer life and trying to get it set up. And he had this one time when he kept trying to meditate, just over and over. He's trying to get it, he never could get it in. It was always a distraction. He'd fall asleep or something. And I mean, sooner or later it dawned on us, well, the problem was it was just the wrong time. He's never going to be able to meditate at that time. He's got to find a time earlier in the day when he's able to pull this off. Also, the place is important. In fact, I believe that it's really helpful to always meditate in the very same place and in the very same posture, because just getting in that place and getting in that posture very often already begins to put us into a prayerful mood. Important thing in all this is don't worry about distractions. They come too bad, no problem. Remember that it's not just a time to think, but to be open to reality. Too much thinking will get in the way of meditation. Remember, our left brain's working all the time. We're always thinking. Better we got to shut the thinking off. So we shouldn't be trying to think when we're meditating. It's not that kind of a process. It's more of a process that allows to happen, that releases this intuitive side of us, this creative side. That's what I think is really happening in the meditation. And finally, it seems helpful when we end the meditation, if you're doing it, you won't want to move quickly or do anything. When I teach it to a group, I often notice when they come out of it, they're very slow. If you stand in, and I think that's important. And what we want to do with it is try to carry it with us through the rest of the day. It's not just like 20 minutes in the morning, whoopee, I got it in, cross it off the list, but it's something that I'm trying to maintain that calm, centered, reflective mood throughout my day. And finally, the techniques that we have to meditate. The one is, and they all have a similarity about them, is that to try to shut that left brain off, is to focus and look at one object just intently and carefully, and don't let anything stray. Just stay with it. So one might look at a flower or a leaf or a racquetball, as somebody recently told me. If they meditate on a racquetball and the top half of it or one half of it, that's the way they are able to do that. So one just keeps intently looking at that. Again, what that hopefully happens is shuts other things off. The Zen Buddhists like to recommend the whole business of just concentrating on one's breathing. Just very intent, just the breath going in through the nostrils. How does it go? How does it feel when it comes out, and so on? Just over and over, concentrating on the breathing. So I'm now in rhythm with the breathing. Now, a third kind of technique is what is often called the mantra meditation these days. That's the kind that I use myself. I learned it first from J.D. Salinger, Franny and Zooey. Some of you might have remembered reading Salinger years ago. And a guy was walking around saying the Jesus Prayer. Jesus Prayer is a prayer known in the Eastern Christian monasteries, where a phrase, which I never remember, so I won't try to say, Jesus have mercy on me, for I'm a sinner, something like that, is said just over and over. And the idea was so that the name of Jesus just would become part of one's breathing. Now, some of you know that if you take TM, Transcendental Meditation, for $100 or so, they will teach you how to do this. I often tell people I will teach it to you for nothing and in about 3 minutes. because the technique is very simple, and that is you just sit yourself down, the same posture, put your hands in your lap, feet on the floor, close your eyes, breathe in through your nostrils, and as you let your breath out, every time say your little prayer. So I always say, my Lord and my God, to myself. And I almost feel it. I say, my Lord and my God. That there is that lowering and centering as one goes through the process. It seems important to me to find a saying that fits or feels good or that seems right, and something that has a positive ring to it. Although Benson teaches people to say the word one. And in the Eastern traditions, they will teach a nonsense phrase in order to help people to meditate. Well, that is the end of the third room here, and I'm not going as fast as I had anticipated. Took longer. Let's take a break here, and in a few minutes we'll come back and start in room 4.